Clara Iwasaki's second visit to HKU virtually recently. She gave a talk several months ago and on another aspect of her research. And Professor Gina Marchetti and I, after seeing that, said, wow, we need to get you here to talk about Zhang Eileen and Xiao Hong. And we thought, what a perfect opportunity on in honor of International Women's Day to do that. You know, those of you who've been following the event in Hong Kong, it tends to be a very corporate space in Hong Kong. There's been a lot of events scheduled across the city on women in the workplace. But, you know, I think we feel strongly here in the Gender Studies program and the Center, the Committee for Gender Equality and Diversity, that the arts and humanities have a lot to tell us on this important day. So my name is Elizabeth LaCouture. I'm the director of the Gender Studies program, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Clara Iwasaki, who is an assistant professor in the Department of East Asian Studies at the University of Alberta in Canada. Today, she's going to be talking to us about some of the work from her recent book titled Rethinking the Modern Chinese Canon, Refractions Across the Transpacific. And for our friends tuning in from the University of Hong Kong, that book is available virtually through our library. So as soon as this is over, you can go and read it online. And it's an excellent, excellent book. Her talk today is titled Transpacific Celebrity, Xiao Hong, Agnes Smedley, and Eileen Chang. And so I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Iwasaki. She's going to give us a presentation. We'll have some commentary from Professor Nicole Huang of HKU, and then we'll be open to your questions. So we're also looking forward to hearing from all of you. So Dr. Iwasaki, please.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for that incredibly kind introduction. And thank you all so much for coming. I do just want to briefly thank all of the organizations that made this event possible, as well as Dr. LaCouture, Dr. Marchetti, Georgina Challen, and Dr. Huang for participating in this and for inviting me. And I'm just very honored to be coming to Hong Kong U again to present other aspects of my work. I look forward to hearing your comments and I hope you enjoy it. So without further ado, I'm going to try to share my screen here. And so, you know, this talk is sort of an amalgamation of two of my chapters and a few of the arguments that I present here. But one of the other sort of ways that I tried to connect these two chapters that otherwise have some kind of different arguments is actually sort of a thought that I had when I was doing research in the HKU library when I was a graduate student, and a few of you in the audience, I think, already know me from that time. But I spent a lot of time reading a lot about Zhang Eileen, and I spent a lot of time reading about Xiao Hong, and a lot of the things that I read were often, you know, which one of Xiao Hong's husbands loved her the best, you know, or does Zhang Eileen have an Electra complex? And at a certain point, I started to feel like I really just didn't care. And I didn't really want to hear about this anymore. So, you know, in these two chapters, I have attempted to not, you know, continue to contribute to discourses that are very popular sometimes, but, and I suppose they're very important, but they're not really what I want to go with. And so I guess in the spirit of International Women's Day, I'm just not really interested in the men in their lives particularly. Okay, so I'll sort of, the first part of the talk is kind of based on the Xiao Hong chapter. And I've added a few people from the poster, but it would probably have been a bit too crowded anyway. But I'll be talking a bit about the relationship between Xiao Hong, Agnes Smedley, Upton Sinclair, very briefly, And Helen Foster Snow, who is a much less well-known sort of American China hand, but also plays a really interesting role in certain aspects of this. So I'll kind of start there. So I'll sort of open with this image. So this is a kind of replica that was published on September 1st, 1941 in the Hong Kong newspaper Shidai Wenxue, which was edited by Duomu Hongliang. And it publishes this very brief letter from a leftist American writer, Upton Sinclair, to Xiao Hong, which I won't read. I think it's fairly short. I think you can read it there. And so, the question I suppose I would open this section with is this. Why was an American writer exchanging letters and manuscripts with the Chinese writer in Hong Kong, right? And so, despite the fact that Xiao Hong and Upton Sinclair are both well-known writers in their own countries, their association with one another has been almost completely unknown or not talked about. Howard Goldblatt has talked about it earlier, so I'm not uncovering anything terribly new, but it's not something that we talk about very much. But the existence of this letter is evidence of the possibilities of the Transpacific connection between American and Chinese leftists, even if that potential was certainly, left unrealized because Xiao Hong would very shortly after this, die of an illness. So, the advent of the Cold War following Japan's surrender meant that American and Chinese writers found it much more difficult to facilitate open exchanges like this for several decades. And the meeting of these two iconic American and Chinese writers in the pages of a Hong Kong newspaper is a moment that hints at a professional friendship that might have been, even if it was never realized. So Richard So has kind of talked a bit more about, for example, Agnes Smedley's role in efforts to free Ding Ling, who is also, a fairly well-known, female writer of the period from house arrest. That kind of, interaction is much more well-known, this one less so, right? And so although there's very little personal connection, right? There's any kind of personal connection with between Xiao Hong and the American literary scene is really fleeting, right? It's very scarcely mentioned. So, and yet there are these moments in Xiao Hong's own corpus where the influence of this connection kind of emerged from the text. So in her widely anthologized story, Shou or Hands, the protagonist Wang Yaming, famously sees her mother's own death in the passing of Sinclair's character Maria in the jungle. And I don't have time to get into it here, but I'm happy to talk about it if you're interested. Xiao Hong's first translation into English shortly after her death was translated by Helen Foster Snow in 1941. So we see, as early as 1941, Xiao Hong moving from, Chinese literature through English translation into American literature in a way. So the circulation of Sinclair's work in one direction and Xiao Hong's in the other was facilitated by the American journalist and novelist Agnes Smedley, who was a friend of both authors. And I have a picture of Upton Sinclair and Xiao Hong here. In many ways, Xiao Hong and Agnes Smedley's literary personae could not be more different. Xiao Hong has been canonized in the People's Republic of China as a leftist Chinese writer, whereas Smedley has languished in obscurity in her own native United States. In part, Smedley's obscurity may be because the majority of her work, in fact, focuses on Chinese subject matter. So she's in this kind of gray area. She's not American enough for American literature, but not Chinese enough for Chinese literature. Most of her work is written in English. Smedley has had a bit of a resurgence in her work, of interest in her work, in part because of the transnational and transpacific turn in scholarship that has made her career much more intelligible, as well as something that we don't always get to talk about, the fact that with the declassification of certain material, she was revealed to be a Soviet agent. So this, I think, again, prompted a bit of a re-examination of her work. Xiao Hong has also experienced a surge of interest, largely centered around the 100-year anniversary of her birth, in 2011. However, this interest has primarily been focused on her biography rather than her writing. There are two biopics of her life that emerge around that time. So, Smedley herself, right, is a really remarkable figure. She's known as a war correspondent. She documented the Communist War against the Japanese in World War II. And she was a fiction writer in her own right. Her semi-autobiographical novel, The Daughter of the Earth, was one of the first works of American proletarian fiction, even though it is now, has kind of fallen into obscurity again. So Smedley has a really uncanny knack for being at the center of a number of political movements. In the 20s and 30s, so she was involved in feminist and reproductive rights circles in New York. She joined the Indian independence movement in Germany, and then traveled from Germany overland to China, finally arriving in Shanghai in 1929. And it was in Shanghai that Smedley met Lu Xun, who would eventually help her enter Chinese literary circles. And the two become really fast friends. Although Smedley spoke no Chinese at the time they met, and Lu Xun no English, they were able to communicate in the language they did have in common, which was German. And so it's during this time that Smedley is introduced to Xiao Hong, who recollects their meeting in Shanghai in 1936. And so this is a quote from Xiao Hong's essay. Again, I won't talk about it too much in this talk, but again, it's a really interesting essay. There's a lot of it's very oddly written, and there's a lot of really interesting points that are made in it that I would love to talk about, but don't want to take up too much time with that. So again, if you're interested, I will happily bore you on that topic for a very long time. But she says of Smedley, and the translation is my own, right? Agnes Smedley was already an acquaintance. I had met her 2 years ago in Shanghai. She wore a leather jacket. She was a bit fat. Actually, she wasn't fat, but she was a big person. She had a laugh that would peel out, and when she laughed too hard, tears would well up in her eyes. She was an American. And the essay is sort of ostensibly a review of two novels by two female writers, Smedley's Daughter of the Earth, or Dadi de Nuer, being one. But it also becomes a much more interesting rumination on the reception of women's writing, and a lot of other interesting things. But this is, one kind of piece of Xiao Hong's impression of Smedley. So, Smedley becomes a sort of key figure in the literary exchange between the Chinese and the American left. Her friends included not only some of the most famous writers in China, such as Lu Xun, Ding Ling, Lao She, and Xiao Hong, but also Upton Sinclair, who's come up already, and Margaret Sanger in the United States. And so at the time that she makes this introduction literarily between Xiao Hong and Upton Sinclair, Smedley is working as a newspaper correspondent and reporting her observations of China for readers back home. While in China, she also formed a part of a contentious group of American China hands. Okay, sorry, I got a message about slowing down. Okay, so let's see, where was I? A contentious group of American China hands, among them Edgar and Helen Snow, Emily Hahn, and John K. Fairbank. And so these connections would have lasting impacts on all lives involved. And so Smedley, brings or sends a manuscript of Xiao Hong's story, Ma Fang Zhi Ye, to Helen Foster Snow to be published to be translated and published in the magazine Asia. And so I'm going to change the slide back here. Helen Foster Snow is pictured on the right, and she's not, I think, a particularly well-known, she's not a particularly well-known literary figure. She was a writer in her own right, and she was also a translator and an editor. She's probably best known as the wife of Edgar Snow, who I think is quite a bit more famous. And her biographer, Kellyanne Long, is probably the only person who's done a full-length study of her. It's kind of tried to theorize why she's just not as famous as Smedley, as Edgar Snow. She's not part of the kind of three S's of American, Sino-American friendship. One of the reasons is possibly because she in fact wrote under the pseudonym Nim Wales, as a way, I think, to kind of distinguish herself from Edgar Snow. But because of that, a lot of her writing is not immediately associated with her own name. And so this makes her sort of an interesting figure. Again, the translation that she did with Jia Wu is interesting, but I'm not going to get into it too much here because it's not necessarily about celebrity. But I do kind of want to talk about the way that Helen Foster Snow shapes the way that Xiao Hong is received by the readers of Asia magazine. And so she goes through this in this very kind of complicated manuscript that she has called Unlacquered Tales of China. And so she has a number of different versions in this of biographical notes that she kind of used to create the biography that accompanies Xiao Hong's story when it's published in Asia. This is the first publication of an English translation of Xiao Hong at the time. And so it seems like quite natural that Xiao Hong would have a little biography to introduce readers to who this person is. So, when she's kind of writing about this experience in her manuscript, Unlacquered Tales from China, she says she asked Xiao Hong for some biographical information. And she includes what she received, which is essentially a translation, an English translation of one of Xiao Hong's pretty well-known autobiographical essays, which is 永久的憧憬和追求. And so, this is an essay, if you're not familiar with it, that really kind of briefly recounts Xiao Hong's troubled relationship with her father, as well as her grandfather's attempts to protect her and their tenants from her father's abuse. This is an essay that I think really touches on a lot of the familiar tropes of Xiao Hong's literary persona in China. So, liberated woman who resisted familial and class oppression. And the story ends with an oblique reference to Xiao Hong's adult life as a wanderer who has left her home for good. Again, this kind of persona that Xiao Hong has as a tragic wanderer, someone who's always seeking for home but can never find it, right? These are things that I think, have been kind of picked up in the rest of her literary persona. So this essay is not really an author's biography in a conventional sense, but rather a really impressionistic kind of personal account of Xiao Hong's origins and some really intense accounts of her memories. For whatever reason, Helen Foster Snow relies on a number of other sources instead of this essay, which Xiao Hong, seems to have provided, for a suitable author biography for Xiao Hong. And so she says that, excuse me, I'm going to just move this here. So instead, she relies on a number of other sources, including something from the Beiping Xinbao. And she says, this provides some really interesting information about her. And I've provided the author's description that she came up with and finalized there on the slide. She says, it's telling that, or I feel, it's telling that Snow prefers a third-hand account of Xiao Hong's life to the writer's own self-description. Unfortunately, the excerpt of the article that Snow includes in her description is somewhat factually inaccurate, but it does provide a really colorful account of Xiao Hong's marriage and subsequent divorce to a wealthy college student. And so, there are a number of ways in which this is, I think, a bit of a sort of editorialization of Xiao Hong, to present to American readers. So unlike Xiao Hong's own account of her life, this newspaper story characterizes her life in tumultuous and scandalous detail. Xiao Hong's Chinese friends and colleagues tend to support the kind of narrative that she provided Snow. She's a sort of Nora-esque young woman breaking away from a cruel and oppressive traditional family and seeking her own way, even if that way is very lonely. This narrative fits into a sort of general May 4th rhetoric of liberated youth rejecting tradition and oppression. In her translation of an account of Xiao Hong by another, Snow refracts Xiao Hong in a markedly different way. So rather, her characterization of the account places a much more sensational cast upon her life. Right? She uses words like, as you can see here, right, abandon and revelry, which kind of highlight Xiao Hong's perhaps, giving it a bit more of a sexually decadent flavor. Right? She wrote of things that no other woman writer had the daring to touch upon, also suggests that what she wrote was taboo and possibly transgressive, when in fact Xiao Hong's writing, particularly in her early years, was much more kind of sensitive due to its sharp class critique, and then also similarly very sharp critique on gender oppression. you know, the way that the controversy is being read here is much more in terms of, you know, sexual excess and daring, and not necessarily these other kind of aspects that are often highlighted in, you know, Chinese representations of Xiao Hong. So this discrepancy in, you know, Snow's idea of Xiao Hong and the writer's vision of herself, and I won't get too much into it, but they are somewhat indicative of how the two translators approach her story. Smedley, on the other hand, has a really different take on Xiao Hong, and she talks about this. She mentioned Xiao Hong just very, very briefly in her book, The Battle Hymn of China. And she talks about the fact that, you know, they had known each other in Shanghai. She runs into Xiao Hong again when they're both in Hong Kong. And she has this to say. It's sort of similarly intriguing to what Xiao Hong says about her, and similarly brief, but I still find it quite interesting. You know, and so she says here, a new Chinese womanhood in many ways far in advance of American womanhood was being forged on the fierce anvil of war. One such woman lived with me for a time in Bishop Hall's country home. Her name was Xiao Hong, and her fate was typical. So Smedley goes on to compare Xiao Hong to Song Meiling, Madame Chiang Kai-shek, and, you know, at the time, probably the most well-known Chinese woman in the United States. And so she kind of goes on to say, after talking about Xiao Hong and talking about her, you know, I often wondered what would have happened to the whole Song family if they had been born in the poverty and obscurity that bound most of the Chinese doing duty in the war zones. So in this passage, Smedley makes a sharp observation that the fame and acclaim that the Song sisters enjoy is a result of their luck at being born into a wealthy and powerful family, rather than their individual brilliance or strength of character. They were born into different circumstances. Their lot may have been as unfortunate as Xiao Hong. So Xiao Hong here for Smedley is presented as a counterpoint to the economic and political elite of China, right? And especially the type of Chinese person who was most visible, right, in the public eye at this point. She's depicted as both emblematic of a new generation of Chinese women forged by the revolution, as well as, interestingly, an example of the oppressed proletarian of China. And I would say, I don't know if that's how Xiao Hong would have constructed herself, but that is sort of how she's being positioned here. While Xiao Hong sees encounters with American literature as an opportunity to contemplate the universality of experience, something that she does get into in that essay, Smedley uses Xiao Hong as a counterexample to Madame Jiang, encouraging the American reading public to look more closely for real Chinese heroism rather than a nationalist elite. I think one of the other things that is sort of interesting here is that Smedley is, I think, quite unusual among her American compatriots because she explicitly characterizes Chinese feminism and Chinese women as more advanced, right, than the sort of feminist movement in the United States. And I think that aspect of this is another really interesting thing that, in the interest of time, I'm going to move on. But again, I would be happy to kind of talk a little bit more about that. So that, I think, concludes my Xiao Hong segment here. Okay, I'm going to move on now to the second half of my talk. And so this is about, you know, Zhang Eileen or Eileen Chang. I never know which one to use, but I may use both interchangeably. I'm very sorry about that. And talk about the way that Zhang writes her kind of late trilogy in a certain way of autobiographical novels. And one of the things that I've focused on here is the construction of the main character as a parasitic parent or a parasitic child. And tie that, I hope, to the question of why these stories or why these novels were never published, some of the concerns that were raised about them, you know, and how these maybe resonate with Eileen Chang's literary celebrity in various somewhat uncomfortable ways. Okay, so here are, you know, our sort of main characters. And the songs are obviously also sort of have a very strong Hong Kong connection, right? So in 1959, Zhang Ailing's former husband, Eileen Chang, published a memoir of his life, right? Jin Sheng Jin Shi. And he had served in the Wang Jingwei government. And while some of the memoir concerned his political career, a significant portion detailed his many love affairs. This included a much scrutinized chapter, 民国女子, concerning his courtship and marriage to Zhang Ailing. And he sent a copy to her. And as expected, the prospect of receiving and reading a memoir written by a former spouse in which he featured prominently was not a pleasant one. And so she, in a letter to C.T. Xia, professor at Columbia University, she comments, the part of Hulan Cheng's book that talked about me was irritating to the point of being bizarre. He can't be as old as all that. So by this time in 1959, Zhang's literary success had eclipsed that of her former husband. This may be why Hu took pains to emphasize his proximity to his most famous ex-wife. So shortly after the publication of Jin Sheng Jin Shi, Zhang starts to work on a fictionalized account of her life, which eventually developed into two Anglophone manuscripts, The Fall of the Pagoda and The Book of Change, which I think many of us may be aware were not published until long after her death. Right, so they were completed in 1963. They feature the main character is a girl named Lute, who, like Zhang, grows up in Shanghai and then later leaves to study abroad in Hong Kong. And so Zhang had sent both manuscripts to English language publishers with very little success. The contrast with the success of her ex-husband's memoir, with the success of which perhaps at least in part was due to his writing on the coattails of her own literary celebrity in Taiwan, must have stung. And so in her letters, Zhang alludes to working on a novel, on the novel, which has been, quote, brewing for too long, unquote, at a furious pace. And in a letter dated October 10th, 1975, I'm sorry, I have mistyped the year in the slide. Zhang mentions to her friend, Stephen Song Qi, and his wife, Mei Feng Song, that all of the motivations I have for rushing to finish Little Reunions was that I received a letter from Zhu Xining telling me that he has started work on a biography of me based on Hulan Cheng's account. She asked him not to write the book, but had no faith that he would honor her wishes. The concern that Hulan Cheng's words would continue to define her reputation for Sinophone readers gave her work a new agency, and the novel. So this new novel was a Chinese language exploration of the same topic as this earlier two Anglophone novels. Eventually, this manuscript would not only cover the same span of time, but also depict its main character's life after she returns to Shanghai and then after she immigrates to the United States. So like Lute, this main character, Jiu Li, is a stand-in for Zhang, but rather than stopping at this time, it kind of follows her trajectory until she becomes a middle-aged woman. So Zhu Xining never wrote the biography he mentioned, but his inquiry seems to have motivated Zhang to accelerate this work. And she completed work on Xiao Chuanyuan, or Little Reunions, in 1976. So although Little Reunions takes place largely in the 1940s, it also includes a number of flash forwards to her affairs with other men, the author Yan Shan, or the actor Yan Shan, and the American writer Rudy in the 1950s. And so, she remarks to the songs, in Little Reunions, I don't hold back when I talk about myself either. And though she was clearly nettled by Hu's depiction of her, Zhang writing herself was not any more flattering. Her response to Hu's version of her was to portray herself, or a character who closely resembles herself, as an unemotional, money-loving, unconventional woman. Although Jiu Li is an interesting character, her lack of any kind of demonstrative feeling has made her, very unlikable, even for sympathetic readers like the songs. So although the songs don't dispute the merit of the novel, or any of the novels that they read, they suggest a number of edits that are really designed to thwart this desire of Zhang Ailing to tell all. And so they recommend changing some very key details of the character Shao Zhiyong, who is a very clear counterpart to the still very much alive at this time, Eileen Chang. And one of the reasons they give is that, he's alive and he has many powerful literary connections in Taiwan. So the negotiation between the Songs and Zhang over whether to seek publication for little reunions represented a contestation between the influential forces that shaped Zhang's career: politics, self-representation, and family. So the Songs request edits in the interest of safeguarding the writer's own reputation. They don't want Zhang Eileen to be identified with her main character's complacent willingness to be in a sexual relationship with a known Japanese collaborator, or to have, and this is a part that I will focus a bit more on in the talk, to have an abortion out of wedlock, right? These characteristics might not fit the idea that her readers had about her. As one of her new Taiwanese readers, who is also Zhu Xining's daughter, Zhu Tianwen, observes, the passionate scrutiny that Zhang commanded from her readers and her press transformed her into an inscrutable monster, both placed on a pedestal and made into a sort of like reclusive monster. So although all of the authors, or both of the authors that I've discussed here, have drawn upon their life in order to captivate readers, Xiao Hong is also really well known for writing a number of autobiographical works. Zhang really draws upon it very heavily for the entirety of her career. And she freely admitted that a number of her early short stories were inspired by her various relatives, who were often not amused to see their private affairs immortalized in print. However, after Zhang left China, her career not only drew upon her personal and familial history, but took on what I term a literary parasitism. Although she always had referenced people and events in her own life, her later career is characterized by a kind of almost obsessive bilingual rewriting, where she rewrites and rewrites and rewrites many times, both in English and Chinese, things that she had already written. And so the three novels discussed here can be seen as a continuation of this retreat. It's, this kind of ultimate sort of cannibalization of her own myth, but they also mark a sort of interesting new development in her career. Although her work had often referenced the lives of her family members, she had never addressed the details of her own life in such a complete and unflinching way. So Zhang's unsentimental depiction of the parasitic, exploitative, or murderous nature of these relationships is a significant part of what so unsettled her friends and her readers of songs and made them recommend against the publication of Xiao Tuanyuan. So this eventual convergence in Zhang's autobiographical novels is refraction at its most self-consumptive. At the same time, examining the mutual refractions presented offer the reader the parsing of the evolution of Zhang's self-reflection. Okay. So in thinking through these novels and in thinking through of how to think about them, one of the things that I found quite helpful was Michel Serres' concept of the parasite. And I'm going to go to this next slide now. So Michel Serres' concept of the parasite was sort of helpful to me in thinking about the ways in which, she is interacting and consuming in many ways her own career. And Serres defines parasites as a kind of interruption or disruption of a system that can eventually overtake the system itself. A parasite, he describes it as an intruder that eventually prompts a fundamental reorientation within the system. And so I've included one passage from his work here, right? So it was only a noise, but it was also a message, a bit of information producing panic, an interruption, a corruption, a rupture of information. Was the noise really a message, or was it rather static, a parasite who has the last word, who produces disorder and who generates a different order? So Serres sort of imagines the parasite as an anomaly or as an aberrant piece of information. For parasitism for Serres is ultimately both destructive and transformative, reshaping the existing structure to allow it to continue to profit and exist. There is a bug in Zhang's authorial system. It was Hu's autobiography, which changed the way that Zhang was willing to engage with her past publicly and as a continuous narrative. So in their letters back and forth about the novel, Zhang and her friends the Songs consistently raise Hu and his possible motivations and responses in discussing little reunions and possible revisions. So although Zhang doesn't go as far as Hu as to identify her characters by their actual names, it's not difficult to identify many of her family circle and close friends, right? This is fundamentally different than many of her earlier autobiographical works of fiction where she lays out a number of subjects, but it's always maybe a little bit more unclear. Okay, so one of the sort of things that I'd like to talk about is the way that the main character deals with money as a sort of substitute for affect. And particularly there's like an interesting resonance, I think, between these two scenes in Xiao Tuanyuan. And if you're not familiar with the novel, there's like a really key moment where Jolie is a student, like many of you, I think, at Hong Kong U. One of her teachers gives her a scholarship. She's really proud of it, and she gives it to her mother. And then her mother immediately gambles it all away. And this creates this real kind of rupture between the mother and the daughter. And as a result, Jolie is really carries with her this desire to repay her mother for all of the money that she spent on her. And this kind of culminates at the end of Xiao Tuanyuan with Jolie, and she imagines it in this very interesting passage as like she feels like it will be like presenting her mother with a bouquet of flowers. Like she feels like it's going to be this like amazing gift. And so she brings out this money, right, 2 liang of gold, and she tries to pay her mother back. And her mother won't take it, right? Her mother, in fact, finds it deeply troubling, right? Deeply insulting that her daughter would try to buy her off. And that's sort of how she sees it. Jolie kind of sees money and love as being the same thing. Her mother doesn't see it that way. And so her mother, prefers that this debt be repaid in filial devotion, whereas Jolie sees this as a matter of settling a debt, right, between two equal and perhaps unrelated people. Her mother's protestation that Jolie would not treat her this way if she had been a stranger seeks to reposition the act of repayment as unfamilial, as fixing an amount on her repayment. By fixing an amount to her repayment, Jolie is treating her mother as less than a stranger. Although Jolie seems surprised by her mother's interpretation of repayment as an attempt to end their relationship, her urgency at repaying her mother and her repeated mentions of her desire to repay suggest that she does intend the repayment to be a significant act. And so her action here disrupts the filial economy of where being born obliges one to allow one's parent to mold one's fate, only for one to do the same for your next generation. What's kind of interesting here is that this isn't the only time that Jolie attempts to kind of like replace affection or end some sort of affective bond with money. There's a very similar scene at the end of Jolie and Zhi Yong's relationship, in which she gives Zhi Yong's niece, Xiunan, 2 liang. And in this case, Zhi Yong accepts it. He lets her give his niece the money, and he doesn't say anything about it. The scene is striking for its almost identical framing to that of the scene with her mother. It's in the same room, and it's exactly the same amount of money. Unlike her mother, Zhi Yong accepts it, and this is really the kind of the beginning of the end of their relationship. So Jolie attempts to alter the fundamental logic of both relationships to make concrete the emotional demands on her by putting a monetary amount on them. And although this payment would theoretically put an end to their relationship, Zhi Yong's presence in her life continues to linger on, just like her mother's. In the end, though, both Zhi Yong and her mother can physically leave her, but their emotional hold remains long after they're gone. And despite her attempts to kind of get rid of this affective debt, these sentiments continue to emerge most acutely around her pregnancy and the end of her pregnancy. So in addition to the description of Jolie's marital and extramarital relationships, the other episode that caused the Songs, her friends, especially Stephen Song in particular, to find the manuscript really problematic is the frank depiction of Jolie's abortion, which was illegal at the time in New York State. And in a letter to Zhang, he insists, we are not prudes, 我们并不是 prudes. However, even Stephen Song, who's a supportive reader, finds her depiction of the abortion hard to reconcile with the rest of the story and with a sort of sympathetic main character. So, he says in the letter to her that he hopes that Zhang, by writing this really autobiographical account, and I've put it up here, can just get it out of, you've gotten it out of your system. You can get it out of your system. And so after that, he hopes that she can begin to remove the more identifying details of the novel and mold it into a work that's like much further away from reality, right? That he hopes that now that she's kind of told, kind of gotten it out there, that she can kind of return to a kind of earlier mode of lightly alluding to or, disguising some real events, with fiction. However, although this is his hope, Zhang never makes the revisions that he advised, and the surviving manuscript includes most of, as far as we know, the autobiographical materials that he had advised her to take out. It remains largely the way that Zhang had excitedly described it in her earliest letters to her friends, a story that she'd always wanted to tell, even if it was not very flattering to herself. And he's not the only person who finds the abortion difficult. C.T. Xia writes about this quite a bit, and I've changed the slide here to reflect some commentary that C.T. Xia has in his published collection of letters between him and Zhang Eileen. So C.T. Xia prefers to lay the blame for the abortion, and this in this case is referring to Zhang Eileen's own abortion, on her financial situation and on her husband, and the failure of her husband, Ferdinand Reyer, to be a husband and a provider, right? So he says, even if a woman doesn't like children, how could she bear to abort her own flesh and blood? I suppose it was because of her financial situation. It was because her financial situation wouldn't allow her to keep it. Taking care of a sickly husband was already not easy. She had to work. Who would have the energy to raise a child? So both Stephen Song and C.T. Xia gingerly talk around their discomfort with what they consider, or perhaps they consider to be, an unnatural and perhaps more to the point, unwomanly act. So as a woman, Zhang should have wanted to have a child. Little Reunions does not draw such a modest veil over Jolie's abortion. She depicts it very clearly and states that she did not want to have a child. And so here I've changed the slide as kind of answering passage in Xiao Tuanyuan, where Rudy, who is kind of clearly identified with, I think, Ferdinand Reyer, says, having a little Sheng wouldn't be so bad, Rudy had said upon hearing the news, although he said it without conviction. Jolie smiled, I don't want it. Even under ideal circumstances, I wouldn't want it, even if I had the ability and a reliable person to care for it. So Jolie has been described as an unlikable protagonist, and I believe it's Lai Pang who described her as a protagonist of weak affect. Her decision to end her pregnancy is one of the reasons that the Songs find this character so unappealing. However, examining this depiction of her pregnancy and her decision to end it in relation to the many other depictions of parent as parasite, which I would be happy to talk any of your ears off if you give me the chance, makes it clear how inextricably her decision brings together many other themes explored in the rest of the novel. One of the things that I'll kind of focus on here, though, is that at the end of Little Reunions, Jolie, in having this abortion, unites these two figures that kind of emerge in the novel, the parent as parasite and the child as parasite, into one person, the murderous child. So this is a sort of logical extension of the alienation of affection between mother and daughter in the novel. this is a sort of fear that is echoed in the Anglophone version. So in The Fall of the Pagoda, which is the Anglophone, kind of counterpart to this novel, the main character, Lute, overhears her mother telling a friend about a dream she had. Her mother says, she dreams that her daughter was there. And although she doesn't elaborate on the contents of the novel, Lute, quote, had the feeling that for a moment there, her mother had been afraid of being murdered by her. So Little Reunions diverges from Fall of the Pagoda and doesn't have a similar scene, but this issue of matricidal revenge raises its head when Jolie has a dream at the end of this novel where she is still married to Zhiyong and has a crowd of children whom she recognizes implicitly as being hers. She reflects within the dream that this is strange. I'm going to change the slide here. She never wanted a child. One of the reasons had always been that she felt as if she had a child, it would definitely mistreat her. It would be her mother's revenge. So this statement is a curious way of justifying one's desire to not have children. Jolie doesn't want to have children because they would become her nemesis and enact her mother's revenge of being a bad child on her. And so in this case, Jolie, the victimized child, steps into the role of the mother as parasite instead of her mother. It is Jolie who fears that her child will harm her in some way. And at the same time, Jolie remains the child in her mind because her fear is motivated by the fact that any child she might have would in some sense belong to her mother and have no function other than to serve her mother's purpose. Okay, so to sort of wrap up, I'd just like to kind of turn to a slightly different aspect of this and just sort of reference a really interesting essay that David Wang Dowei wrote about Zhang Eileen, where he characterizes her as a literary matriarch. I believe the title of the essay refers to her as like Zhu Shi Nai Nai, where he lays out contemporary writers who are heirs to the Zhang mode. And her unlikely apotheosis into a literary matriarch is a reflection of her immense popularity and long-lasting influence. It's hard to know how she would have felt about this role. After all, Zhang, like her characters, never expressed any interest in continuing her line. So thank you so much, and I look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Iwasaki. What a way to end that talk with that quote. it's still churning in my mind. Well, we're so privileged to have comments today from the University of Hong Kong's very own professor and chair in the Department of Comparative Literature, Professor Nicole Huang. And I just want to note that Professor Huang is very modest, and when I asked for a bio, she said no need. But I do want to note that she is the author of a book that is very foundational to the talk here today and foundational to my own work as well. And that is Women, War, Domesticity, Shanghai Literature and Popular Culture of the 1940s, which talks about the work of Zhang Eileen and others. So please, Professor Huang, offer us some thoughts and reflections on today's talk.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, Clara, for giving me this opportunity to think about the connection that are inherent, but from your presentation, I could see the connections very much there, deep among the three figures that you talk about. I never actually thought about putting the three of them together in the same context. So thank you for this opportunity to make me think about the possible connections. When I got your topic, when I got your title, when I got your abstract, I was thinking, yes, a presentation on Eileen Chang and Xiao Hong, because these two are iconic writers, canonized, right, in modern Chinese writing, Chinese and Sinophone writing. So yes, I could also see a presentation on Xiao Hong and Smedley, right? So the connections very much there, intertwined at different points in each of their careers. But to put the three of them together, I was thinking, where exactly are the connections? Then I was listening to your talk, your second half of the talk. You talked a lot about 小团圆, about little reunions, and talk about the motherhood that never actually happened or existed or realized. And Eileen Chang, vis-a-vis her characters, entangled, tormented relationship with the mother figure always there. So maybe I thought maybe motherhood is a possible connection to connect the three figures, right? Xiao Hong also had this troubled, tormented childhood and has several pregnancies, right? Under great circumstances that is really hard to imagine. So it was also a motherhood that never really realized, right? So Agnes Smedley, I remember reading somewhere at a certain point that she wanted to adopt a boy, a Chinese boy, right? But also never happened. So there's something about this tormented childhood, motherhood, that somehow might be able to connect the three figures together. Then I also thinking, listen to your presentation. I hear two big presentations, right? One is about Xiao Hong and Smedley. The other is about Eileen Chang's later style, her later writing. But there might be some connections. There might be some other ways, I think, to put the three of them together in the same context. So I did a little chart. On this chart, I put three different the moments in history. The first would be 1936. The second would be 1937 to 38. And the third would be 1940 to 1941. I thought these three moments in history, we could possibly put the three of them in the same context. Okay, so 1936, you already talked about in your presentation, right? It was in Shanghai. It was actually in the residence of Lu Xun, right? Lu Xun was the one who brought Xiao Hong, at the time was a budding young writer, right? Exile from the Northeast, from Manchuria to Shanghai, in the same living room with Agnes Smedley, at the time who was the English secretary of Song Qingling, of Madame Sun Yat-sen. So, so they were together with other figures in 1936 in the living room of Lu Xun. So that was when they first met. So where was Eileen Chang at the time? Eileen Chang at the time was also in Shanghai. She was a student at St. Mary's Hall. She was reading Bernard Shaw. And she was also reading Lu Xun as a teenager. She actually liked Lu Xun's essays, regardless of people say, you know, she represented a different direction, right, of modern Chinese writing, apart from what Lu Xun represented. She, as a teenager in 1936, a student at St. Mary's Hall, which was a Christian boarding school for all-girl Christian boarding school in Shanghai in 1930, she was actually reading Lu Xun, among other texts. So that's 1936. Could put three of them in the same place, right? 1938 to 37 to 38, that was Wuhan, right? The Battle of Wuhan in 1938 that broke out, and seems to be that the entire world came together in Wuhan in 1938, right? So the media fixated on that moment, which was a watershed moment in the the Japanese War, right? So it was, that was when Agnes Smedley saw Xiao Hong again in January 1938, and that was at a roundtable discussion to discuss Daughter of Earth. Right. So that's when they saw again. Where was Eileen Chang? No, she was certainly not in Wuhan in 1937-38. She was actually getting ready to take exams, to wanting to go to University of London. She was admitted into University of London. Of course, she did not go because of the war. Instead, she came to HKU in 1939. So the third juncture, 1940 to 1941, three of them were all here in Hong Kong, right? I mean, the story you talk about where you, in your presentation, you talk about how Smedley not only saw Xiao Hong in Hong Kong, which was Xiao Hong's last days, right? Sick, poor, pretty much at the end of her life, right? But nonetheless represented a new womanhood to Agnes Smedley, which is very different from what the Song sisters represent. The Song sisters were actually all here too, as well as Emily Han, right? So Smedley talk about she's different from herself, being different from Emily Han. Emily Han just completing a biography of the Song sisters, right? But to Smedley, she wrote about the Song sisters, as you said in your presentation, they're so privileged. I instead wanted to write about this new womanhood, new Chinese womanhood, represented by this. I think I remember she called Xiao Hong the girl. The girl, the girl, in addition to this, also wrote a bunch of other things, but the girl was dying, right? The girl was very, very sick. So that was Hong Kong. Eileen Chang was here too. She was a student. She was a second-year student in leading into her third year, only to be cut short by war. So what is it I want to say? I want to say the three figures somehow intertwined by these major historical events and by travels, both figuratively, but also physical journeys. But on the other hand, they're completely divergent. Even Agnes Smedley and Xiao Hong, even though they intertwine so much more in the course of their lives, they were divergent. In Wuhan, when they met in 1937, 1938, Smedley went up north to Yan'an. Xiao Hong decidedly not going up north. Instead, she insists on going south, right? Somehow ended up in Hong Kong, again, being very sick and very poor, and continue to be emotionally tormented, right? So I see these three figures as incredibly divergent in their each course of life, but somehow you're putting them together. I was trying to draw in this chart and to see where could there be the connections. I really appreciate, I really enjoyed your book. For those of you who are listening, I highly recommend it. So Dr. Iwasaki presents 4 case studies in her book, right? For canonical writers, but instead of focusing on the canonical texts they each wrote, she highlights what is the minor within the major. These are major figures, but she highlights the minor connections of the major figures that help bring out the connections that we often overlooked. So I think very, very interesting. So maybe, but then maybe there are other ways, other connections to think about bringing these three figures together. And maybe there's one other juncture. I was talking about 36, 37, 38, 41, 40. Maybe there's another year, it's 1950. 1950 was the year that Smedley died. She died on her way back to China, right? She was in London. She was running away from the McCarthy era that was looming on in the US. She was running away to London and wanting to, by way of London, getting back into China to celebrate the founding of the People's Republic of China. She was so happy about it, right? So she realized her stage had always been in China and no one else, but she died out of illness in London. She never really made her way back to. So 1950, where was Eileen Chang in 1950? She was on her way to leave China, right? Agnes Smedley was trying to get into China, but Eileen Chang was on her way to leave, to depart from China. Xiao Hong, of course, died in January 1942, but her legacies lived on, as you said, in translation, right? Entered into both Chinese literary canon, but also world literature. So her legacy lived on. So I was thinking about more in terms of divergence rather than connections. So this is my immediate comments and response and to your very, very interesting presentation. So I'm sure there are other people who want to have questions and comments, and I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Huang. That was just really masterful and so amazing. Like there are so many details that I wrote them all down. I really need to think more about it, but just really a lot. Thank you so much. I have to think about this more, but it's really some really interesting key points there. Yeah.
Do you want to respond to any of that or open the floor to questions?
I guess I wasn't sure what I should do. I'll just take like a little bit of time. I was just
we have plenty of time. So
okay. Thank you, Dr. Huang, for this. I feel like you've really laid out so clearly. You make it look so easy, but this is in fact like a lot of thought, or at least to me it seems so. But it is sort of interesting, like in this period that you talk about, that there are these kind of intriguing moments, right, of divergence, right, or occasional convergence, but often in cross purposes, right? Even in Hong Kong, Zhang Eileen is going because she can't go anywhere else. For Xiao Hong, it's kind of the final refuge, like that kind of thing, right? And as Xiao Hong, as you say, is at the end of her life. Smedley is kind of embarking on, she's returning home, and Zhang Eiling eventually will return home as well. So, all of those things I think are quite interesting. I feel like maybe one other thing that when I thought about how to put these together, and originally, I had not really conceived of putting them together in the book. They're in separate chapters, but one of the things I guess I thought about was maybe also an American connection, even for Xiao Hong, even though she never gets there, but that she's there in a way through translation. Zhang Eiling is headed there. Smedley goes and then regrets it, but there is a sort of interesting way in which I think at a time in the 40s and the 50s, when we don't think of them as being particularly connected, they are, seen as, especially by the 50s, as being on the opposite sides of the Cold War divide. No one's supposed to be going. That there's still these sort of like interesting ways in which you can kind of link them. I guess I'll just like add a few other things, and then I think I'm happy to take any questions if there are any. But I think one other thing that I thought about in relation to Smedley too, the Emily Han part is really interesting. I'm very interested in her. I don't know that much about her, but she's so interesting because in part because Smedley and Han like really did not like each other, or at least Smedley seems to have fought with everyone. So I'm not sure like how much of this was mutual, but Han for her seems to kind of be this like anti-her. She's like very close to the songs, and like Agnes Smedley falls out really drastically with Song Qingling, and then they just like are not, they won't even really be near each other. And so that's interesting too, right? Like I think that's a really interesting part of that I hadn't really thought about in relation to this contrast between Xiao Hong and the songs, that there was this animus between them. Emily Han is also kind of mythologizing them in a way. And then the other person that I think I thought about, and I didn't put her in the title, so this is, my own kind of oversight, was Helen Foster Snow, who's also, again, somebody that did not get along with Agnes Smedley, and also, had this like kind of much more like a very oppositional relationship between the two. But maybe unlike Emily Han, Smedley and Snow could occasionally overcome this to collaborate with one another and to kind of collaborate in bringing Xiao Hong, to English translation, which I also thought was quite interesting. But within this, there are a number of kind of like transnational or transpacific convergences or divergences that are kind of a parallel thread there. So I think those are the thoughts that I had. They're somewhat piecemeal, but I really appreciated this. This gives me like a lot to think about, and I really appreciated the really careful and thoughtful and very deep like chart. I really find it like very interesting, and I look forward to thinking a lot more about it. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. So we have time for questions. You can feel free to raise your hand and I will call on you and you can unmute and potentially show yourself to ask your question, or you are welcome to type a question in the chat. Okay, Dr. Jason Coe has a question. Welcome, Jason. Please unmute yourself. Jason, you're welcome to ask your question. We can't hear you, but you are unmuted. And now you're muted. Okay, maybe we'll go here. Okay, he said, so thank you, Jason. You're gonna fix your problem and we'll come back to you. Thank you. Well, actually, as we're waiting to get to Jason's question, I actually have a question that kind of connects these two that I was thinking about as you were talking. So as a historian of Chinese women's history, I find in particular kind of the Xiao Hong narrative becomes the narrative through which we frame Chinese women's history, right? And I've often thought of Zhang Eiling as a counter to this narrative of Chinese that we typically frame Chinese women's history, though she may not want to be. I mean, though she may not be that counter. But I'm just wondering about the ways in which these two women, their own personal narrative becomes part of their story, how that is produced in the Trans-Pacific, and then the legacy for how we think about Chinese women and Chinese women's history. So I'm wondering if you can kind of explain like the mechanism that is at work here.
That's a really interesting question. And I really thank you for it. I think that I agree with you. I do think that Xiao Hong is this sort of maybe not Nora prototype, but she does kind of live out this Nora narrative in her own life, right? And there are a lot of ways in which, a lot of her choices, I think one that Dr. Huang mentioned particularly, right? The choice to go north or the choice to go south, right? Becomes read very large, kind of as part of her political, her political ideology or her political failure. I think I've seen it asked quite often, why doesn't she go? And, sometimes as a sort of snarky graduate student, in a library, I'm like, well, she was very pregnant and in very bad health. So, I'm not, sometimes I'm not always convinced that this was like a political argument, like this maybe was not this sort of like great arcana of political ideology. Like it may have just been like, she was extremely pregnant and she did not want to like go overland, all of this stuff. So I do think there are ways in which like her choices are often kind of aligned in this way. In terms of actually, to return to something that Dr. Huang said, this idea of motherhood not to be, I think in certain ways that also sometimes could be read in terms of like, can you have love and revolution? Can you have motherhood and revolution, right? It's very awkward. Students will often ask, if I teach something where she's pregnant, they're like, well, what happened to the baby? And it's like, we don't know. And that doesn't go over very well, right? They're like, how do you not know? And it's like, we don't know. Like, the baby is not in the picture. Either baby is never in the picture. So there are also those ways in which she sits in certain ways kind of uncomfortably. She sits comfortably as a writer, but not in other ways. So, that stuff is always quite interesting. I don't know if this is exactly related to the question, but I will also say, like, her final unfinished novel, Ma Bo Le, which is so interesting, right, is often something that no one wants to talk about, in part, I think, because so much of her other writing is this kind of self-writing. It's this, very strongly autobiographical. A lot of it is autobiographical, not all of it. And again, it kind of, feeds into this like kind of lonely wanderer, kind of unconventional spirit, that fits very nicely. Writing about a Qingdao colonial man in Hong Kong doesn't fit that very well, right? And so in that way, she herself is much more complicated than this kind of like new woman figure. In terms of a counterweight, right, in terms of Zhang Eileen, I think that I doubt she would want to be a counterweight, but I also think like it's sort of interesting to think about how she becomes an alternative, largely, I think, after 1950. I mean, maybe a little bit before then she was popular, but I could be mistaken about this, but C.T. Xia and Xia Jian are part of the process of canonizing her. And there are, I think, a lot of reasons that we can think about in what we know about them for why they would find her to be an attractive figure to do that. She's got a really kind of Anglo feel to her, even though she herself like never went to England, to be educated. She has, a lot of like Somerset mom and like, a lot of this kind of feel to her that would appeal to somebody like that. And, this kind of emphasis on aesthetics, right? This emphasis on the language, the thickness of the description, right? All of these things like are very anti-leftist, like, not necessarily explicitly anti-leftist. I think, again, Dr. Huang says this like really nicely, that it's like, not that she didn't know Lu Xun and not that she didn't enjoy some of this, even though she kind of becomes constructed as the anti-Lu Xun in a lot of ways. So, and yet she's convenient in certain ways, like being from Shanghai is also convenient. I honestly think even being Li Hongzhang's granddaughter is also convenient. Like there's so many ways in which she represents or can be constructed in her persona to represent a kind of continuity that if you look at her in other ways, she's not, right? It's a story that we can tell ourselves. So that's a very long, convoluted and messy answer to that, but I hope I've addressed at least some of that. But thank you for the question. It was a really good one.
It's a messy question. I love the answer. So Dr. Ko, are you all set to pose your question?
Yep, I'm ready.
Oh, good to hear your voice.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Hey, Clara, good to see you. Sorry, I can't turn on camera. I'm very under the weather. Thank you so much for this talk. Thanks for coming to hang out with us again. It's really nice to hear your voice. So just kind of want to ask you to comment on two things. First is these women are, you focus on women writers and the kind of network that they're building together. And I'm wondering, do they see themselves in that way? Do they see themselves as women mutually interconnected with, common predicaments? Do they share a sort of feminist, mindset about writing for each other and writing for women and as women? You talk about it as, ideological and political, but was there a sort of sense at that time that, we're also women and we're writing for each other and we care about this and see ourselves that way?
Yeah.
And then secondly, I was wondering if you could Yeah. And then my second comment, and I guess that kind of leads on top of that, and is how the way that you're describing, the history of that time, it's like, oh, this person, sorry, I think my internet still working? Can you still hear me? Okay. Hello? Hello? I'm sorry. My internet kind of went down, I think. Can you hear me still?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, cool. All right. So my second of the time, and I was really struck by, how you're talking about how this person really wanted to get there, but then they couldn't because of the war. This person really wanted to get to this city, but then they weren't able to. And I just can't help but think like, oh, I really want to go back to LA, but I can't. I haven't seen my family in 3 years, and I really want to hang out with Clara and go to this conference in Taipei, but it's been canceled, right? So it's like, how does the situation that they're going through at the time, what can we learn from that about our current situation as cultural producers and critics, thinking about it, on International Women's Day, like, how do we maintain, create feminist connections? And what are the kind of things that happen? What can we learn from history? So thanks.
Thanks so much, Jason. It's really nice to hear your voice. Yeah, I wish we were meeting in Taipei soon too, but those are some really nice questions. Thank you very much for those. I'll try to answer them as fully, but hopefully as like not long-windedly as possible. So in terms of like women writers, Xiao Hong, I think, really has a very strong sense of herself as a woman writer, and a writer who has a really strong sense of solidarity with other women, and particularly other women writers. Part of the chapter that I didn't talk about actually gets into the process of reading, the act of reading Agnes Smedley's novel, Daughter of the Earth, and has a really interesting passage where she's two male writers or male friends who she doesn't identify by name, basically come in and start like making fun of the cover. And she has this like very kind of interesting thought process where she says, I can see a male beggar sleeping outside and I can recognize that this is a person and he shouldn't sleep outside. I don't really understand why it's so impossible for men to not make women the butt of the joke, which is a very Xiao Hong way of kind of like in a very roundabout way making an extremely revolutionary point, which I really like about her. But I do think she has, I think, a really strong sense of a sort of sympathy between women, a kind of way in which women understand one another. And there's a kind of like resonance, or there's a kind of sympathy. I think there's a lot of that's like in play when she's talking about reading Daughter of the Earth and then Restless Days, which is by a Danish author that she's also reading. She's also a woman. So I do think that Xiao Hong often does make a lot of these kind of like gendered, but like transnational connections with each other. Eileen, I'm not so sure, I'm not really sure, but I also find it very hard to figure her out. I'm not sure if I've seen something that's like as clear from her. I will say, I can't remember where this is. I believe this is in probably a letter to one of the Song couple, where she kind of goes through a list of different writers, including Han Suyin and a couple other sort of Chinese American or like Sino-American or Hong Kong writers, and basically is like, I am not that worried about these people. Like, I am not that worried about Han Suyin. I don't really think, I don't really think she's as good a writer as me. And so in that, and it is sort of interesting because a lot of them, she doesn't say, well, these are also other women, but there is a way in which the people that she's selecting to say like, yeah, I'm not that worried about that person. This person's okay, but I don't know. I still think I'm pretty good. There is, I think, a certain kind of community, although I think it's a bit more of a like community that is permeated by a kind of like emotional static electricity that's a bit uncomfortable. But I think it's there. I do, but I think it's like it doesn't. It's not in the same way that I think Xiao Hong has an almost idealistic or kind of like very utopian idea of like what women can do, what women can feel, what women can understand about each other. I don't know if I feel that from Zhang Eileen, but I'm happy to be wrong if someone wants to point that out. That's just my initial take on that. But in terms of what we can learn from now, I mean, I will say, yes, I really feel you as a person who's also not been to California in 3 years. And in fact, I don't think I've left Edmonton in like 3 years, which it's a lovely place. It's fine, but I never thought I would be here for 3 years straight. And I really want to eat a lot of many things, but including a taco, I would kill for a taco. So I think in terms of this, though, I mean, there is something interesting about like writing, both of them, I think, in certain places. Zhang Eileen, certainly by the time she's writing these later novels, is writing back to a place that she probably realistically doesn't think she's going to ever go back to. And I don't think that's quite where we are yet. I certainly hope not. But I think there is a certain quality, there is a certain way, and Xiao Hong does this for her whole career. Xiao Hong is constantly writing about Northeastern China. She's constantly writing about Manchuria, but she's never going back. Like, she wants to go back, but she never goes back. And so many of her like most famous works are written at a remove from the place that they're about, which I think sometimes a little bit gets lost. Where it's like, oh yeah, she's from the Northeast and she writes about the Northeast. It's like, yeah, she writes about the Northeast almost exclusively when she is no longer there and can't go back. So in that way, I think there is something kind of linking them. I think there is maybe a way of this idea of writing backward. I hope we're not there yet, but I think there's something there that we can learn from that. I mean, I think we can definitely learn that we never stop thinking about it. But I would also say that Xiao Hong and Smedley, I think, are a kind of suggestion that one can continue to make connections, even if you are at a remove, even if sometimes you're not in the same place, that these things are possible. Even before the internet, even before Zoom, right? Xiao Hong was getting around. Even after she died, her works were moving. And so I think there's something there for that. So thank you for those questions, and really nice. Hopefully we'll see each other soon sometime.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, and there's quite a few great questions and comments in the chat. So if you have a chance to check those out before we go completely black. Thank you to Professor Laughlin and Dr. Ford for putting those in there. I wanted to make sure we have the opportunity to ask Professor Gina Marchetti's question, which came in a while ago in the chat. And she asks, I originally thought about Hong Kong's position connecting so many different political threads during the Sino-Japanese War. However, Professor Huang broadens the map. So I'm wondering if you could comment more on the American woman in Yan'an and this northern choice, Dingling as a contrast example. And also, could you say more about the parasite and the baby case? So in 5 minutes or less, please.
Okay, sounds good. I'll try to keep it brief. Those are really great questions, and I think I need to just take screenshots of other stuff. These are, I'm really happy to answer these. The American women in Yan'an, I'm mostly familiar with two. So Agnes Smedley being the first, and then Helen Foster Snow, who was really mad about being the second one. So mad about being the second one. And again, like there's this sort of weird friction relationship between the two of them, where you would think again that they would at least kind of get along, and they kind of do. I do think their rivalry gets blown out of proportion a little bit, because you do see that they can do work together. What's sort of interesting there is that, they're both there for stories. And I think they're both really anxious to kind of get something that Edgar Snow and like some of the American men in Yan'an can't get. And so I think they approach it in different ways. I think somewhat famously, Agnes Smedley sort of runs afoul of Mao Zedong by kind of getting in the way of his marriage at the time. Helen Foster Snow kind of seems to react to this by positioning herself in support of Mao's wife at the time. Like these things are sort of interesting in that I think part of this is certainly related to access and certainly related to other things like that. Smedley's teaching like the men of Yan'an ballroom dancing, which I think also caused a lot of friction. But I also think there are ways in which they're also positioning themselves as a certain type of American womanhood. Foster Snow very much kind of being like, I am like pro-marriage and pro-wife and like pro-monogamy. And Smedley kind of being a lot more like, you know, I'm out here, you know, like we're all kind of out here. We can be a little more bohemian about it. And so, you know, in that way, I'm not sure if it for either of them, Snow in particular, I don't know if it's really a Northern choice, right? For Dingling, it really is, right? Dingling sacrifices a lot, you know, it kind of changes her life, right? To go up there. So I do kind of feel like for both of the American women, their orientation is still a bit more towards America. They're also getting their money from reporting to American audiences. So I think that also plays a role in it. In terms of the parasite and the baby, okay, I have like 2 minutes. I think that there is a way, I think it might be, I think when I started, I thought it was going to be that the baby was the parasite, but I actually think, I think ultimately Zhang Eiling is more interested in exploring herself as the parasite. She's sort of harmful to both her mother and the baby. And there's this, you know, kind of chilling part that I didn't talk about, but after she has the abortion, she's like, did it work? Did I waste $200? Which again is like this sort of like weird moment of like money and some kind of emotion and something else. Like there's all kinds of like interesting things going on there that I feel like are not, I think it's more common to kind of see the baby as like a potential, I mean, this is not, I don't mean it in a bad way, but like a baby does like live inside you and it, you know, eats the things that you eat, you know, and then you have to, you know, then eventually it leaves your body, right? There are ways in which I think they fit really nicely, but I think in this case, she's the kind of one that's sort of like a malignant, you know, she constructs herself in a way as a malignant force between the two. So, okay, I'm right on time. I think I'm done. So I'll leave it there. I have a lot of other things I could say, but I guess we'll end with a malignant baby and or a malignant Zhang Eiling and not a malignant baby. And I'll call it a night. So I don't know if that's where I thought I would end, but
I know. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
You know, you gave us so much to think about today. And for those of you who want to engage more with this, please, I urge you to check out Dr. Iwasaki's book, Rethinking the Modern Chinese Canon, Refractions Across the Transpacific. It's available electronically, HKU Library. So for those of you from the University of Hong Kong, you can check it out today. And thank you, Professor Huang, for also your amazing comments that are a paper in and of themselves. So have a lovely evening, Dr. Iwasaki. Have a lovely day, friends in Hong Kong, and thank you for joining us.